Good morning, everybody. It's lovely to be here today on what feels like a sunny Friday morning where I am, and hopefully where you are as well. I'm delighted to be joining you this morning for the next in the Green Transport Recovery webinar series, Achieving Net Zero Commuting. And I'm delighted to be joined this morning by Clabburn, founder and CEO of Liftshare, Mobilityways and C-Lab, Dr. Bob Moran, Deputy Director, Head of Environment Strategy from the Department of Transport, Mark Dodwell, Director, Future of Mobility Group at NatWest. And this morning we will be hearing from all of them all around this subject topic, which seems so topical at the moment, all around commuting. But before we start this morning, we'd like to start the discussion with a short clip, which will hopefully set the context for our discussion this morning.
We start with the stark findings of an international team of scientists led by the UK Met Office.
Today's report is yet more evidence that the growing concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is changing our climate. The reduction of Arctic sea ice cover and melting of the permafrost has accelerated during this year's heat wave.
Terrifying signs of things to come, according to tonight's dire new assessment from 13 federal agencies,
with potentially disastrous consequences for the planet. However, the last 3 months have seen some significant changes.
And this is the very last moment when we have in which we can actually hope to stem some of these disasters.
The vision for Mobilityways is to make zero carbon commuting a reality. And I created Mobilityways because it's just become really clear that unless we decarbonise the commute, we will fail our net zero goals. The commute is one of the least efficient journeys any of us ever make, and the commute has become the single largest source of emissions in the UK. It now accounts for 18 billion kilos of carbon every year. 90% of us travel alone to work every morning. 40% of us could cycle to work but don't. 40% of us could go by public transport but don't. 10 million of us could share a lift with someone who lives within walking distance of our house, but we don't share a lift. And yet we face a climate crisis. We need to decarbonise our commute, and there are solutions there right now that are not only better for the environment, but better for us, better for our pockets, better for our health. We need to change how we travel, and we've seen through the success of our sister brand Liftshare over the last 22 years that there are ways that we can shift behaviours, and it's proven to work, and we need to do it fast, because in reality we've only got 10 years to really start shifting the dial on this, and we've got to make a move now. If we fail to make zero carbon commuting reality, we will fail our net zero goals. And if we fail our net zero goals, our children will not forgive us.
Well, I think that's really set the tone for what we will be discussing this morning. And before we commence, just to introduce myself, I'm Tania, Kumar. I'm Principal Policy Advisor at the CBI, and I cover infrastructure and energy policy, and have been looking at decarbonisation of transport for the last 4.5 years now. So I will be hosting this morning's sessions and taking us through each of our speakers this morning. But ahead of that, I just wanted to give a little bit of an introduction, as many of you might be thinking, why is the Confederation of British Industry so interested in the future of the commute? And I think it's been a really interesting time for ourselves, just looking at what the UK economy, what the world has experienced in the last 12 months. And at the forefront of that has been looking at this journey of the commute. And with our members, prior to the pandemic, we'd been talking a lot about the way that we make journeys. And there have been so many different reasons as to why the commute is so important. And I just wanted to run through this morning just a few things at the top of my mind that we have been discussing with businesses right across the UK. First, when we look at the commute, it's been, a sore point in terms of quality of life. If you talk to anybody about transport, the first thing that comes to mind is already disruption and delays, whether they've been taking the train to work or whether they have been stuck in a traffic jam. So clearly there's something around the commute that if we can improve journey times, improve the quality of that time spent in the commute, you actually add to people's quality of life. Secondly, as we've heard from the clip just then, we've set ourselves really bold net zero targets. And I'm sure Dr. Bob Moran will be talking us a little bit more about the Department of Transport's ambitions for a new Transport Decarbonisation Plan. But clearly these journeys need to be tackled if we are going to reach those sweeping targets of net zero. And more importantly for transport, it continues to be the sector that contributes quite significantly to emissions and therefore needs to be tackled. So how does the journey of the commute actually play into that, considering that it's a journey being taken every day? Thirdly, we've obviously talked a lot prior to the pandemic about these new ways of working. And actually, during this period, we've seen that accelerated. But at the same time, we cannot forget that obviously there have been lots of people, essential workers, frontline staff, that have still been taking that journey to the commute. And we've also looked at how people might look at the ways of working, going back to offices, going back to their jobs, and actually that flexibility now in our day-to-day lives. Do we actually need to travel that often? And when we do, are there the options available to do so? And finally, we've got this ambition as a country to actually deliver world-class infrastructure. But what does that actually look like? Well, it looks like a combination of obviously delivering new pieces of infrastructure in order to level up access to transport up and down the country. But also it's about utilising existing infrastructure better. So when we make those journeys during that sort of period in the day, why are we doing it? And this has raised really interesting questions, I think, at the moment around peak times of travel, flexibility in tickets, cross-modal use as well. So I think that's really set the context for us with the business community. And for us, actually, at the CBI, we have been looking at the journey of the commute. We've undertaken a campaign with KPMG over the last 18 months. And I think some of my biggest reflections, actually, is just to see now that the commute is at the forefront of so many businesses' decisions at the moment. If I were to ask this question to businesses 18 months ago, many were questioning, how do I actually know how my staff come to work? And actually, if I look now, that's just a question now that everybody is asking. It's front of mind, not only for the health and safety of staff during this period, but for also understanding how when we come back to working environments, how do we actually improve the quality of life for our employees? Secondly, I just want to finish off on a bit around looking at transport in itself. I think transport is something that we always take for granted. And during this period, we've actually seen the value of transport for not only moving people, but goods across the economy. And there's something quite interesting now that we're moving towards this way of looking at transport, moving from A to B, to actually now looking at this concept of mobility. The actual element now is giving choice to people. So whenever you want to make that journey, having those options on hand, on ready to make that journey in a way that's affordable, that's actually reducing emissions, and that's comfortable for you and your families. So I think just setting that up today, there are so many questions, and I could not think of a better cast list to be discussing this topic with today. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Ali Clabburn onto the screen, CEO of Liftshare, Mobilityways and C-Lab, to talk us a little bit through what his journey has been. As you've heard, he's been looking at this concept for quite some time. And why is it now, Ali, that we should be taking some action as businesses, as individuals, as a community?
Good morning, and thank you, Tania. And thank you, Landor, for putting together this webinar. We're absolutely delighted to be sponsoring it. There has never been a more important or relevant time to be having this discussion. But it simply cannot be just a discussion. We need to start acting, and acting right now. It's great to see so many industry friends joining us today, but many of you won't know us, so a quick introduction. For the last 22 years at Liftshare, my wonderful team have been helping UK companies to run some really successful lift sharing schemes for their staff. By this time last year, we had over 1 million shared trips on the network every month. And collectively, our clients and members had saved over 1 billion car miles. In 2019, when we'd seen client after client after clients like Arup and National Grid increase car sharing levels from less than 10% to over 40% within months of launching, we felt we'd finally discovered the magic dust to get people car sharing. But then overnight things changed. Today, exactly a year ago, there was a first major outbreak of COVID at the Nike conference up in Edinburgh. And in a couple of days, very sadly, there was a first British death. As a country went into lockdown and 50% of us started working from home, at Liftshare we had a bit of an epiphany. No longer was sharing cars the best way to get to work, in my mind. Working from home was just as good, potentially even better. And if roads were clear or clearer of cars, so many more people could walk or cycle safely in our cities. And on rural roads too. More than 1 million travel habits changed during that first month. That's more changing travel habits than in the last 50 years. But the question we were all asking was, would it last? Next slide, please. But before daring to hope that this change that we had seen was sustainable, we realised the key value we could add was to speaking to our clients and speaking to our members. So we've undertaken a number of surveys, but it was the first survey we did back in May 2020, when we heard that 48% of commuters planned to travel differently post-lockdown than how they'd got into it. And this was the opportunity we felt we'd been waiting for the last 20 years. And we quickly mapped out our new vision and we launched a new sister brand, Mobilityways, to help us lead it. Next slide, please. That mission is to make zero carbon commuting a reality. Whether it's working from home, catching a lift, walking, cycling, shifting to EVs and buses. EV cars and buses. We wanted to be able to help our employers and individuals to get to zero carbon commuting as fast as possible. Next slide, please. So why do we target the commute? Well, as the video at the start showed, the commute accounts for a shocking 5% of all UK emissions. And for many companies, especially those office-based companies, it can account for over 1/3 of their emissions. So if we fail to cut commute emissions, then we will fail our zero carbon goal. And as I said in the video, I don't think our children will forgive us. Next slide, please. Transport is now the single largest source of emissions. And emissions from cars are the largest part of that. And commuting journeys are the largest cause of these emissions from cars. If you look at this graph, you'll see that it's the commuting journeys that are between 5 and 50 miles long that cause the most harm. So whilst it is really important that we encourage active travel on shorter journeys, we need to realise that unless we can find solutions for these journeys over 5 miles, we simply will not shift the dial on reducing emissions. Next slide, please. So how do we tackle this? Well, we listened to our clients really carefully, and there were 3 key reasons they fed back to us why they hadn't previously been focusing on reducing their commuting emissions. The first point was they didn't have an easy way to measure it. The second was they weren't really clear of how they could influence commuting behaviours. And the third was that they very simply weren't required to report on it. Unlike for many of the other emissions, like office emissions from energy and that side, commuting wasn't included within the mandatory guidelines for many companies. So they simply hadn't been focusing on it. Now, we can directly help with the first 2 of these, but what recently has been so brilliant is to see initiatives like the SBTI or the Science-Based Target Initiatives including commuting within their requirements. Now we feel the government needs to step up and to do the same. We found firsthand that data drives impact. Bringing travel data to life in a simple and clear way helps drive engagement. Engagement drives decisions, and decisions drive impact. So we set out to build a tool that makes it really easy for employers to measure their commuting emissions. And we've also built other tools over the years and more recently to help them influence those commuting behaviours. So a key thing we did was to invent ASIL. And if there's one thing you do today, I really encourage you to take a look at this. It's freely available on the Mobilityways website. ASIL is a rating system that empowers employees and communities to understand, benchmark, and improve their average commuter emissions level. All you need is to enter your travel survey data, and it will not only calculate your ASIL, but also your total commuting emissions. It will help you identify within a few minutes where most of your commuting emissions come from, so you can start to think about how to reduce them. So ASIL helps you measure your commuting emissions. We've also developed some amazing tools to help you with engaging your stakeholders, with local public transport operators, and obviously with your staff. The most valuable one of these we found is Scoping Smart Mobility. Scoping Smart Mobility effectively analyses every single travel option of every single member of staff and provides your organisation with insights on what is possible right now, what modes are available to every member of staff. It gives you really easy clarity on which areas to focus your efforts on and helps you build the business case for investing in these options. It's also proven a great way to help engage with local transport operators so when they see the maps, they can really easily see where there are gaps in their service provision. Over 90% of the companies that we've worked with to undertake the scoping report have gone on to invest in sustainable travel initiatives. Next slide, please. And to bring all of these services together, we've set up the Mobilityways platform and dashboard. The platform has the ability to run these scoping reports, to calculate your ASIL, to survey all your staff. There's an inbuilt survey tool, or you can do your own. And it helps you see what barriers they have to travelling more sustainably. It also lets you send out personalised travel plans to all of your staff. And it helps you to encourage lift sharing. So what's been amazing has been the response to Mobilityways. Literally in the last 6 months, it's just been incredible. It's like businesses have finally woken up to this. I mean, just last week, we were on a call with a client. It was more of a pitch from us. It was set for half an hour, went on for an hour and a half. We couldn't get them off the phone. And at the end of it, they said, thank you for being there. You're going to make my life so much easier. And it was so wonderful to hear that my team have been working so hard on this for the last year and all the previous years. And it's so great that it's now coming to fruition. What's really exciting is seeing the number of companies and councils setting their net zero goals. And we have seen some companies who had, like they'd said, we want to have a 2040 target. But when they saw the data, they've decided they can actually now go for a 2030 net zero commuting target, which is incredible because they've seen what is possible. We were talking to another client last week who's going to have 50% of their staff working from home moving forward. That's immediately a 50% cut in their commuting emissions. And they've seen that they can get 40% of their staff walking or cycling to work. So how fantastic is that? At the moment, they've got like 5% cycling into work. So huge opportunities to drive that upwards. Can we have the next slide, please? If you just click again a few times, okay. So perfect. So we've not only just focused on employers, but we've worked with a lot of councils too, and they faced very similar issues. Main one around not really having any idea the level of commuting emissions in their region. So we developed this, again, it's a free tool available on the Mobilityways website to help you see your ASIL score locally. In this example, it's showing Leeds. Leeds has an ASIL score of 604, which means that residents of Leeds emit 600 kilos of carbon on their commute each year. And you'll see to the right-hand side, below the ASIL chart, it breaks down every mode of transport and shows that the total emissions from Leeds commuters is 214,000 tonnes a year. That's around 5% of all emissions in Leeds. So it's a big chunk. Can we have the next slide, please? Okay, so just to wrap it up really, and a few suggestions. Knowing that Bob's on the call and that a few policymakers are in the audience, I just want to focus on a couple of policies. For me, it is absolutely essential that we see that COVID has shown us the role that employers can make in dictating how their commuters come to work and how they make business trips too. There is now no reason why employers shouldn't be reporting on their commuting emissions. And rather than just saying that scope 3 should be mandatory, I think that commuting and business travel need to be shifted to being scope 1. They can be impacted by companies. Companies have a direct role to play on them, so they should be included within scope 1. And we've heard this directly from employers too. They want to be reporting on it, but because they're not told to, they haven't been, which is such a shame. Point 2 is that the government really needs to catch up and start walking the walk. It was brilliant to hear Bob earlier talking that commuting is going to be included within the decarb plan. That's great. We want to see the wording in there. But central government employ 400,000 people. That's 400,000 people. That's 240,000 tonnes, roughly, of CO2 coming from their commuters each year. And when you compare that to Leeds was 214. So actually, the government themselves emit more commuting emissions than everyone who lives in Leeds, which is quite phenomenal. And then you look at the NHS, 700,000 tonnes of CO2 coming from commuting to the NHS. So my question to the government really is, why did neither the Greening government guidance or the initial decarbonisation plan mention employers or mention commuting? I hope that they've now listened to the feedback, but this is a super important thing. Third point, now is a time to focus on data. While we're coming out of COVID, now is a time to understand what your staff want to do, how they were travelling, how they want to travel, and to really engage with them to make sure that when we get back to work, get back to offices, we're doing it in the most sustainable way possible and we're making the most of this opportunity. And the final point, let's make the most of this opportunity. If we fail to act, well, we can't fail to act. We literally can't fail to act. Our children will not forgive us. And I think it's the final slide next. Yeah. So yes. So my last point is, please go and calculate your ASIL and just see the level of commuting emissions you've got. Within 5 minutes, I think it'll give you a pretty clear picture. And that's all from me. Thank you for listening.
Thank you ever so much. But I'm delighted that we have Bob with us this morning, Deputy Director and Head of Environment Strategy at the Department for Transport. And let's say, obviously, the Department for Transport, Bob, has a lot on its plate. We had the 10-point plan from government for a green industrial revolution. It announced a 2030 target for the phase out of petrol and diesel vehicles. We've obviously got a busy year ahead with COP26 as well, and transport being a key theme within that. And no doubt a plethora of other consultations across public transport as well, looking at the future of public transport during what has been an unprecedented time for the sector. So I think you've got a lot on your plate, to say the least, but also a very exciting time for the department to be disrupting lots of transport trends. I know many trends that we have been discussing with yourselves for quite some time. So delighted to have you, and I will pass over to yourself.
Oh, thanks very much, Tania. I totally and wholeheartedly agree. What a time to be working in this area. Hopefully disruption for the better, for the good, I think, rather than for the bad. Okay then, so yeah, thanks for the invite today. It's great to be here with the CBI hosting. And Ali, sorry that we missed you at the end there, but genuinely, I'm a fan of everything that you're doing, and I really want to see the change that you are pushing and that you are promoting happen, and I want to see it happen for everybody, everywhere. So to give you a brief introduction to me, I am Bob Moran, Deputy Director in the Department for Transport, and I head up our environment strategy team. So that includes dealing with cross-sectoral issues on climate change, air quality, noise pollution, as well as the natural environment. And that also, it was somebody mentioned to me yesterday, is the author of the Transport Decarbonisation Plan, and I said to them that I think ministers will have something to say about that. But at the moment, a huge piece of work that we're doing is piecing together the Transport Decarbonisation Plan. And that's going to set out how we're going to put transport on a credible pathway, because it isn't at the moment, but we are going to set out how we are going to get transport onto a credible pathway to net zero. Because we've got to reduce emissions from transport, Ali set that out. But not just some, all of them. We've simply got to get to zero. So this topic, given the size of the emissions that Ali set out, is a really particularly interesting one. And given that we're coming out of lockdown, it is a huge topic of interest, not just for me and you, but for ministers as well. And I've talked to them quite a bit about it. I'm afraid, sorry to disappoint everybody, I'm not going to be able to give too much away about what's going to be in the final plan, and certainly not on this topic, but I don't think it will be a surprise to anybody that we're not going to be against this, right? Okay, we're not going to come out and say that we're anti moving to zero emission commuting. Let me assure everybody about that. But I'm delighted to be here today, and particularly to listen and to answer all the questions. So let's head a year ago, back to last March. We launched the first part of our decarbonisation plan, setting the challenge. Described as gobsmacking, it was, and in a good way too, which is very, very, very unusual for a government document, let me tell you. But we launched it just a week or two into the first lockdown. I don't think anybody really could have predicted what has happened and the changes and the experiences that we've all had since then. But over the last year, the whole country has come together to tackle COVID in such an incredible way. And I think at the moment there is hope and light at the end of what has been a horrible tunnel and a horrible time and an awful time for so many people. But we're going to get through this as a country, and there will be good things that come from this. And this is one of them. I think, you know, the last few months have forced people to think about certain aspects of their life quite differently, and I don't think that's a bad thing. And I don't just mean about going on holiday, if we're allowed to this summer, but you know, holidaying at home. That's not necessarily a bad thing if you're looking at decarbonisation, but I'm also talking about things like the high street and potentially reimagining what the high street is and the space there and how it's used. Perhaps more space for people, a bit less space for vehicles, people eating outside. I know that my local council, I'm here in Westminster at the moment, local council sent us an email this week saying that they're going to close the streets again from the 12th of April, in fact. And run that scheme to the end of October, having retail brought out onto the streets. Frankly, I can't wait. It was fantastic last year, and having talked to some of the businesses that I was spending my money in, they really loved it as well. So I'm delighted that hopefully that change is going to be long lasting and stick with us. So on things like that, COVID has allowed us to try some new things out en masse and stop just thinking about it, but actually try it out. And of course, we've seen some new mobility options appear for people as a result of COVID, some more space for safer cycling, some more space for safer walking, e-scooters. This is all good for decarb. And there's big investments coming as well, Build Back Better, you know, the green recovery. You know, that's a real thing. And you'll start to see those investments and that become real very, very soon, I'm sure. Whether it's HS2, whether it's zero emission planes and Jet Zero work that government's doing, or whether it's hydrogen ships, hydrogen maritime. We can lead on the development of these new technologies as the UK to deliver the world, cleaner transport, cleaner technologies. But this can be, and the subject of today, you know, a real moment of change for commuting. I really do genuinely believe that, and it's one that we mustn't miss. If we go back to last March, when we set the challenge on transport decarbonisation, there were three key points really that we wanted to land. The first was that we were going to prepare a plan, not strategy. Now we're nearing crunch time, and it is still a plan. It's not reverted back to a strategy. Sometimes people sort of say, well, what's the difference? Okay, you keep saying this is a plan rather than a strategy. What's the difference? We don't need to produce a document that says, you know, why it would be a good idea to decarbonise transport. We've got to. We know that now, and we know that we can do it as well. But to do so is going to require big changes, big investments, yes, but also some different behaviours. But I defy anybody to come forward with a reason as to say why we can't do it. So what we need is a plan, you know, clear steps that when taken together will then deliver us to the destination that we need to get to. And zero emission commuting is right up and it's right in there, and it has to be, because as Ali set out, you know, it's a huge chunk of emissions. And that's the second point really from last March. You know, we need to get across to everybody, and thanks for webinars and seminars like this and the work of the CDI in this area, just how big a challenge this is. You know, it is huge, and it includes employers and it includes employees. Everybody has a role here. The scale of carbon emissions in transport is simply huge, and it hasn't budged for decades, unfortunately, but it must now. It's got to move quickly as well. And that's the third point, really, you know, and why we're here today. We need to do things differently, not just think about things differently. We need to do things differently now, especially when they're actually delivering a better outcome for people, because what we have been doing hasn't been working. So we need changes. We need more people using public transport, and we will get that in the future. Cycling, walking, okay, maybe not for commuting as much as Ali said, you know, but actually the natural first choice for most of our journeys, it has to be. We need to do that by making those options more attractive to people. You know, making those modes safer, more accessible, and easier to access as well for people. We will be less reliant on our cars in the future. We've got to tackle the single occupancy commuting journeys that are done by private cars. We really must. To do that, you know, a great example today, you know, doing more with data, new business platforms to change the way that we and our goods and services move around the country. So as Tania said, the Prime Minister's 10-point plan gave everybody a sneak peek of some of the big hitting stuff that we've got for the Transport Decarbonisation Plan, phase out for the cars and vans, brought forward by a whole decade. You know, that's a big change, and that's happening now, only 9 years away. But then also, you know, not just hinting, but committing to extending that to trucks as well. And it's strange, is that, you know, as we were thinking about what to say today, you know, this period of time, this period of disruption, hasn't been a bad time actually to be putting something like this together. You know, I can't predict what the commute is going to be like in 30 years time, in 2050. So that does make it difficult to plan, but that's always been the case. You know, there has always been that kind of uncertainty, and I think the best thing that I'd like to leave everybody with a bit of hope perhaps today, you know, the best thing about this from a decarbonisation perspective last year, I think, is that this hasn't dropped off the agenda. It's been just as important, and it was immediately to the fore as we started talking about how the economy was going to build back. You know, this is the global emergency that doesn't actually have a vaccine, and so in the future, I think we'll look back on this 2 or 3 year period that we're probably in the midst of now, and I hope from a decarbonisation perspective for transport, we'll look back and say that's the time that they got a grip of it. That's the time that we all together got a grip and started to change things for the better. So all credit to everybody who is here today and is pushing that change. I think when we look back, as I said, we'll say, gosh, or people will say, flipping it, you did all of that then, whilst you were still dealing with a pandemic and coming all of that. Blimey, how on earth did you do it? But it feels good. It is a busy time, but we can do this, and we're gonna build back better. And this is zero emission commuting, I think, is a huge part of it. So I think I'll pause there, stop there, hand back to Tania, and look forward to a good debate and some good questions.
Thank you ever so much, Bob, for that little wraparound of what the Department for Transport are focusing on, and I can see lots of questions coming through, so there'll be plenty more of discussion. And actually something that Bob just touched on leads me nicely on to introducing Mark Dodwell, Director at NatWest for the Future of Mobility Group. And I've had a couple of discussions with Mark over the last few months, especially looking at the role of business, as I previously mentioned, and actually the power of business not only for actually changing behaviours between employees, but also with customers as well. And I know that NatWest is doing a lot on this piece, looking at how you can shift behaviours. So I'm really delighted that Mark is with us this morning. And Mark, can I hand over to yourself?
Thanks, Tania. Yeah, good morning, everybody. As Tony said, Mark Dodwell, Director of Future Mobility Group at NatWest. This is a new team that was created in the bank at the beginning of last year. I joined right at the outset, January 1st last year. Prior to that, I was leading commercial relationship teams across the bank. So we've been I've been involved in supporting the sort of SME customer base. And much of that role is about sort of understanding customer strategies, how we can add value and support them. And the creation of the Future Mobility team kind of continues that theme of adding value and support. And we very much realised over the last 12 months that future mobility brings all sorts of challenges and opportunities to our customer base and our staff. And I just wanted to spend the next sort of 10 minutes kind of sharing kind of what we've learned and some of the things that we're doing for our staff and our customers, but also kind of bringing to life some of those challenges and opportunities that we've spotted. So if we go to the next slide, please. Yeah, so why is a bank involved? Some of you on the call, and it's a question I get asked whenever I'm at any event, what's a bank doing? sort of playing in this space, and particularly around achieving net zero commuting. This time last year, Alison Rose, our CEO, launched our new purpose-led strategy, and climate is very much at the forefront of that strategy. Ali's touched on it already this morning. That you probably can't see the slide there. I don't know if you can see that or not, but clearly transport is now the biggest greenhouse gas emitter. And the bank took the decision that in order to kind of really focus on this, we needed a new team. That's why we as a future mobility team were created. We're noted as a key driver to accelerating the speed of transition, addressing climate change impacted by all forms of transport. And our aim as a team is to support all areas of the bank and our customers in managing disruption driven by future mobility. So if we can move to the next slide, please. So why focus on commuting? We think it's every employer's obligation. It's definitely our obligation. Future Mobility Group, as I've touched on, we're working with staff and customers, helping our staff and customers. And in the UK, we've got 50,000 staff. We've got 19 million customers. And essentially, they're all commuters. So this is a huge area for us to focus on. Bob's touched on it already, and I think Ali did as well. But those commuters, they're making a huge chunk of those. Ali touched it. 90% of us commute by car, and invariably that's a single occupancy car journey. Others travel by public transport pre-COVID, and I guess the word that's a bit of a buzzword that's come out of COVID really is active travel. It's certainly not something I'd heard prior to this time last year, and I'm a keen cyclist, but it's definitely kind of obviously a way that people commute, and we're kind of thinking for our staff and our customers who are all commuters, how can we help them? So we can move to the next slide, please. So we've given lots of thought to this, and some of the things we've learned along the way of how do you think about decarbonisation of commuting. It's really a case of making the best of what's already out there. Just some thoughts, just a few thoughts we've captured here on this slide. Firstly, encourage active travel. Biking to work, walking to work. Is it possible to provide the facilities that allow people to do that? I think first and foremost, you've really got to engage with staff and talk to them about health, lifestyle. NatWest is very good at kind of focusing on its staff's kind of health and well-being, thinking about climate. Everybody in the bank now talks about climate, and we're starting to think about our impact and that Scope 3 challenge. And I guess to a point that was made earlier, what are our staff's plans for commuting as and when we return to our offices? Majority of bank staff, like most people on this call, will have been working from home coming on a year now. And to Ali's point, it's really about understanding what people's plans are once we come out the other side of the pandemic. The other point on this is lock-in 2020 benefits. As I said, most of us have been working from home. That will have driven benefits for organisations over the last 12 months. And how do you use those benefits to really kind of focus on that decarbonisation of commuting? Is there stuff that you can do from that benefit that changes things as we move further into 2021 and beyond? The other part is data, and clearly this is where Ali is playing, thinking about location versus services versus your colleagues. And using that data. It's not always easy to get hold of, and I'll touch on that shortly. But think about who you're located near to. Who can you work with to come up with future commuting suitable options? So there's thought to be given to that. Whilst we've got a 37 million car park at the moment of primarily internal combustion engine vehicles. We don't want a 37 million park of electric vehicles or alternative fuels. But to Ali's point on some of the numbers he quoted, some people do have to use the car. So we're very much kind of focused on electrification. And again, I'll touch on that shortly. And I think the final point is plot solutions. How do you think about decarbonisation? Well, what are the future solutions for your staff? Bike sharing? Is it lift sharing? Is it company car schemes? What's the infrastructure that's needed for some of those solutions? So hopefully that gives some thought of how do you think about it. We'll move on to the next slide, please. And I'll touch on what we're doing for our staff. The bank a couple of years ago signed up to the climate group EV100. So we are absolutely focused on making sure that our staff are transitioning to electric vehicles. To aid that, our salary sacrifice company car scheme, you can only get plug-in hybrids and electric vehicles on that scheme now. So those that qualify for that scheme don't have the option of normal hybrids or internal combustion engine vehicles. For everybody else, we have a colleague car scheme, and again, all electric vehicles and plug-in hybrids are available to our staff on that. Some staff at kind of junior levels have jobs in these cars. We've transitioned those vehicles, there's 300 of them. We've transitioned those to electric vehicles. And to support all of that electric vehicle transition, we've installed, or we're in the process of installing, 600 charge points across our campuses right across the UK. To aid that, we're working on sort of staff pass. We all carry staff passes. We're building and sort of app development triggered by that staff pass that will help with that whole charging piece. One of the propositions, I'll talk about propositions a bit more in a moment, but one of the propositions we're looking at is telematics. Lots of people would like to transition to EV. There's lots of kind of myths and challenges around transitioning, and they don't know when to. So we're working with a company and hopefully kind of launching a proposition very soon in partnership with a company that helps our staff understand when's the best time for them to switch, and are they ready for an electric vehicle. And something we've launched in the last 2 weeks that we're very proud of, we're the first bank to partner with an energy provider, Octopus Energy, a charge point operator. So we've come together with Octopus Energy, built a partnership. This is for our customers as well. I'll touch on that in a moment. But for our staff, there's benefits and support for installing that home charging if you are converting to electric vehicles. Away from electrification, we're kind of supporting active travel. We've always had the cycle to work scheme in place, but last year we increased that to £3,000, noting that the previous maximum level of £1,000 didn't really support e-bikes, and therefore we've kind of worked with our HR department to get that improved. If COVID hadn't hit, we would have commenced a pilot with Zelo. We were due to start a pilot with Zelo in April of last year. For those who haven't kind of heard of Zelo, they provide bus services to I guess the sort of the outer reaches that other bus companies, the general bus companies, don't get to. Our global HQ in Edinburgh has many thousands of people working there, and we've done some work with them to kind of instigate new services from some of those more remote areas. And hopefully that will come back as we return to offices, hopefully later this year. And something that we just kicked off in the last month, working with Ali and his team, we are building a pilot for Scotland with Mobilityways, looking at how do we enable better staff choices for our commuting in Scotland, and then how do we replicate that across the UK for the benefit of all our staff. So that's what we've been doing for staff. What about our customers? Next slide, please. So how we're supporting them is really around engagement, education and propositions. We've been providing internal training to our customer-facing staff. The Future Mobility team is literally 5-6 people, so we can't do everything, but we have obviously thousands of staff that face off to customers day in, day out. So we're doing quite a bit of training on this subject for them. We are holding customer roundtables and trying to understand what it is our customers want. From our personal customer base, we've built a Go Green hub. So there's a whole range of climate-focused sort of products and services that we're now building, and that's kind of working with our customers. On the education front, we're holding events similar to this, driving awareness of climate and the changing transport landscape. And we're looking at building carbon calculators for personal customers. We're also looking at how we do that for our business and corporate customers as well. And something that we're really kind of driving in the Future Mobility team is developing propositions through partnerships that help our customers make better climate and transport decisions. So if we could go to the next slide, please. Just quickly kind of running through some of that activity that we've been doing. When it comes to, if I look across the three kind of forms of commuting, when it comes to car journeys, through our Lombard brand within the organisation, we're driving that funding of EV transition. We're helping customers make that transition across to electric vehicles and providing that funding for them. As I said earlier, we are working on a telematics partnership, helping our customers make that decision when to transition to electric vehicles. And again, our Octopus partnership is very much available. That's a sort of a pan-group partnership that we've built. Any customer of the NatWest group can see the benefit of that partnership with Octopus Energy. When it comes to public transport, we're supporting electric bus fleet transition. We've done quite a bit of work in London. Some of our finance teams have supported some unique kind of funding structures there. We are working with local authorities, and we've held a number of roundtable sessions trying to understand what are the challenges of local authorities, how can we help them. We've also spent quite a bit of time looking at MAS, Mobility as a Service, and researching that and how viable a solution is that. And I'll touch on that again in a moment. When it comes to active travel, we've been working with some LEPs and some bids on support. How do we help them with their commuting? And most of those, that they have the same challenge that we've called out on this call already. Single occupancy car journeys drives congestion, it drives car parking challenges. So it's finding a different way of getting people into work. And linked to that, is there most large corporate organisations will have cycle to work schemes. It's far less prevalent in the SME world. So we're kind of working with a number of organisations, just looking at what opportunities there are for sort of SMEs to really drive that uptake in bike to work schemes. And similarly, micro-mobility sharing schemes, talking with various suppliers in that space and thinking about how we can help local authorities, LEPs, bids, etc. with that whole active travel. So moving on to the next slide, just before we kind of wrap up, just wanted to focus a little bit on some of the challenges that we've experienced for net zero commuting. And the first one of those is, this is an individual's choice. Hearts and minds kind of gets bandied around quite a bit, but it's an individual's choice to change their commuting practices. It's not the corporates. So we've really got to help with that hearts and minds story. So as I said earlier, it is about engaging with the staff to really understand what they're doing. You need data to support that change, and that's not always easy to garner and gather. That's where Ali and his team have come in and started to help us. Obviously, one of the biggest challenges on commuting has been COVID. Not just the fact that we're all kind of working from home, but clearly public transport has taken a huge hit through COVID, and they've now got to find that balance of investing in electric or alternative fuel transport at a time when their core business had been largely disrupted and revenues are very much down. And I guess linking to Ali's Liftshare side of his business, how long before organisations can realistically look to target Liftshare as a viable option for their staff, and when will staff be willing to Liftshare again in the future? Infrastructure is another area of challenge in two areas really. Electric vehicles, people kind of might want to convert to electric vehicles, but they'll struggle, or they think there's going to struggle to keep them charged when they're out and about on the road. So and the infrastructure around that is probably still in its infancy. It's growing all the time, but still in its infancy. And the other area around infrastructure is on active travel. During the pandemic, we've seen emergency active travel funds, but there's been a real mix of local authorities implementing the infrastructure to support active travel, and it's been a real mixed bag, and therefore caused challenges in some parts of the country. The other challenge linked to electric vehicles, the cost, the myths, and the true carbon footprints of EVs. Every time I talk or my colleagues talk around electric vehicles, those challenges come up all the time. And the final one that I touched on earlier, is MAS really a viable solution? It seems like a fantastic proposition, but it tends to fall down when you get to kind of the commercial model between the different operators, and I guess how viable is it? And that's probably a question that many of us are toying with and maybe don't have the answer yet, but it's one to continue to research and look at and figure out where we take that. So next slide, please. Just in summary, from my perspective and from us, it's every employer's obligation, as I said earlier, to focus on net zero commuting. Measuring and reporting Scope 3 emissions, will it become mandatory? It's kind of a requirement for certain organisations of a certain size today. But for those much smaller businesses, it's not. But should it and will it? And you know, thinking about the future, what do those smaller businesses need to do? I think let's not use COVID as an excuse to do nothing. Ali's touched on that. Bob's touched on that. We really can't use COVID as an excuse to do nothing. There's still much that we can all do to drive net zero commuting. You know, we're just starting on the journey. I'm sure most of you are. There's much more to do, and collaboration partnerships will be key to overcoming those challenges we face. We've realised that, as I'm sure most of you have done, which is why you've joined a call like this morning. And that's it from me. Back to Tania.
Thank you ever so much, Mark. That was a lot to download in a short amount of time, but I can see lots of questions once again trying to tease into how NatWest has gone about this, both for staff and definitely that engagement as to how you have engaged with them, talked them through the options, as well as customers as well. So definitely one for us to pick up on in the Q&A for a few questions. And I think we've had, you know, a whistle-stop tour. Resoundingly, the importance of including commuting emissions looking ahead is something that I've really taken away. And secondly, this importance of behavioural change and employers having a stake in actually making that change for staff, but also customers as well. And thirdly, obviously, this nature that it's not going to happen overnight, but we've got a real opportunity on our hands right here and now to make that shift and make sure investments work in that direction. And I think just finishing off, Ali, on what you just said, I think one of the questions for ourselves as a panel, and lots coming through from attendees as well, is one more generally for the Department of Transport and for government policy as to where does commuting sit within transport decarbonisation, and should it be given, you know, more of a profile, especially in the Transport Decarbonisation Plan. So, Bob, I just wanted to pass that question on to yourself to just get a bit of an assessment of where you think commuting sits, and perhaps touching a little bit on where it should be involved in terms of scope 1 to 3 sort of emissions.
Gosh, okay then. I'm not going to answer that question directly on whether it should be in scope 1 or 3. I was just following on Twitter the conversation and there's a story up today in the Guardian that popped up as part of this, you know, talking about technology is not the thing that's going to fix this. Okay, and I think that is something that I firmly believe there's two aspects to kind of transport decarbonisation. The technology, and if you wanted to wait and assess ourselves in 30 years' time, have we done it? Then we've got time for technology to come through and kind of change the same as the business as usual, if you like. But we haven't got that long, you know. And every bit of CO2 that we emit is a problem, and it's using up the budget that we've got. So we have to look at behaviour change, and I think this is such a ripe area, frankly, for I think a truly disruptive kind of change, not just from working from home, but rethinking and transforming the commute. I think really it has to be, if not now, then when. It's going to be a big focus in the Transport Decarbonisation Plan, partly because it's such a big chunk when you look at things differently, which is what we've been trying to do with the plan. In transport, the reason it hasn't been working in terms of decarboning and reducing carbon emissions, we look in silos, we look at a particular aspect, particular mode of transport. We don't actually look at how people interact with the transport network and the system as a whole. That's the change that we've made with the decarb plan, and so it's gonna look and feel very different, I think, to anything that's come out of the Department of Transport before in terms of how we approach this, because it's not just about technology, it's about different behaviours. And so I think that's crucial. I hope that sort of answers or gives you a perspective, even if it doesn't actually answer the question that you asked.
Well, I think that's positive to say the least, because as you've said, I think one of the biggest frustration that I'm sure Mark and Ali can also touch on is, as you've just said it, working in silos, that actually transport is quite cross-cutting. It interacts with housing infrastructure, it interacts with digital infrastructure, and we need to start looking at policy in that way in terms of how do people actually use transport. And just on that point, Ali, bringing yourself in, from speaking to companies, how have they viewed mobility? Have they viewed it in that way? We've had a lot of focus on office workers, for instance, but as I mentioned, during the pandemic, we've still had a lot of people that have still been traveling to work and don't have lots of different, modes to rely on. What about your reflections there?
So there are two things there. There's people have been there's a difference in how individuals perceive travel during COVID and how employers do. So employers are very risk averse, so they will not tell their staff to jump on the bus or jump on the train or start sharing cars. But individuals behave very differently. So initially, when it was all everyone, there was a fear factor across the whole country. People didn't go on any kind of shared mobility, whether it being shared cars or buses or trains. But as things have come back, the actual level of car sharing has gone back up proportionate to the number of cars on the road to what it was before. So people are still sharing cars, but there's still a resistance to getting back on the buses and trains. So, but I think that will come back, and I think there's a real role for the government to encourage people that it is now safe to get back on public transport, because we need public transport. It's absolutely essential, and it becomes not viable if we don't have enough people on each bus and on each train. So we've got to make sure that it's in the right place, and working with employers is a key way to do that. Employers need their staff to be getting in, they need them to get in sustainably, so they need to work with the operators to get that data to provide better services. But one thing we have been hearing in terms of the policy is when Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions were announced, and neither business travel or community were included within it, they didn't focus on it anymore. They forgot about it. So their environmental teams focused on all the energy of the buildings and all those things, and transport was just been forgotten about for the last 20 years, which is why I'm convinced that as soon as people have to report on their commuting and business travel emissions, companies will cut them, and they'll cut them fast, because the bright cookies at these companies who are tracking all these other emissions will start focusing on transport and realizing actually, if we get people walking and cycling and coming by bus to the office, we can have a rapid impact on our commuting emissions.
Yeah, and just building on that, Mark, for yourself as an organisation, then what motivated yourselves to start looking at the commute?
I think it is exactly as we've kind of said. Climate is at the forefront of our strategy, and it's looking at what actions do we take that if we're going to go out and preach to our customers, this is what should be done. We should be doing it first. And really kind of driving it, and yes, admittedly, to Ali's point, very much focused on Scope 1, Scope 2, but we've spent a bit of time, well, certainly talking to our internal teams, the property teams. When I engaged with them a few months ago, it was we'd kind of thought about Scope 3 and thought about how we measure that and what we do with it. And fortunately, I met Ali and have kind of introduced our property teams to Ali, and all of a sudden it's okay. So there's data there that we can start to focus on that. Like I say, it's very much within the core of our strategy. Everybody in the organisation knows that climate is forefront, and commuting is one part of that. And if I'm honest, we haven't really focused on it, Tanya, until just recently. And we now need to really kind of speed that up, and hopefully with Ali and his team kind of working on this pilot in Scotland and starting to kind of really give our staff in Scotland kind of some choices and thinking about those choices, that leads us from a pilot into kind of what we do across the country. But it's very much kind of at the forefront. If I can just lead on from that, when we think about customers, it's large organisations like the one I work for, absolutely have very much focused on this, as I've alluded to. I think the bigger challenge is in that SME space, and obviously, Tanya, I know from the CBI perspective that's very much what you're focused on. But we see, we call it grip and vision in the SME space. As much as companies would love to kind of focus on this sort of thing, when they're much smaller businesses, they're gripped with running today. And don't necessarily have that time to open their minds to what's coming down the line. Some are very good at it, but there's a lot that aren't, because they've got so much going on, their plate spinning from today's business. And that's one of the things we've got to try and do, is help those smaller organisations focus on this area and what they can do for their staff.
Thanks, Mark. And you've spoken a bit about data, and I've got a couple of questions coming through here. In terms of, how easy is it to have that data to hand? What are you looking at as a business? Because obviously there's a lot of then concern that this is going to be a big exercise to undertake, because you're not usually tracking how your staff get to and from work, for instance.
Yeah, obviously we run staff surveys. We could be looking at introducing questions into that staff survey. As I said, we've struggled with it, and talking to our property services teams that have been kind of responsible for thinking about Scope 3, they tried to come up with our own way of capturing that data to help it. I sound like a bit of an advert for Ali and Mobilityways, but talking to Ali and using the ACL and starting to think about plotting using staff, just a couple of simple questions that you ask staff to go on what they want to do, what their plans are post-COVID for commuting, because we're not in our offices at the moment across the bank. The only people who are in are branch staff because they're facing customers day to day. But it's using sort of gathering that data now to make those decisions. So the data has been a struggle, Tanya, as I kind of said on my slides. It has been a real challenge for us. How do you get that data and how do you then use it? But we're starting to learn that and using Ali and the team at Mobilityways to do that.
Thanks, Mark. Bob, just coming back to yourself, behavioural change, we haven't really sort of cracked the nut on that, really, have we? We've tried to stimulate it when we're looking at the uptake of EVs. We've also tried with sort of increasing, walking and cycling during the pandemic. Just looking at the Transport Decarbonisation Plan and sort of government's thinking, what is the balance there between government policy and business policy to incentivise behavioural change? What is the balance between sort of, incentives and disincentives? Where is the thinking at?
Gosh, very much towards the incentives rather than the disincentives. I think we've run through quite a few really important bits of this. Data is crucial, and as Mark said, not to be an advert for Ali too much or advertise, but it is good. But people haven't had access to this kind of information and data presented in such an easy to understand and accessible kind of format. And until you understand what's going on, then you can't take action to kind of remedy it and make it better. So I think that is something that we've been working on, and increasingly in transport generally, we hold such huge amounts of data, or are able to package it up and put it together, and making that open, which we are doing across the piece. I think the most recent being the bus urban data that we've made accessible. I think we see that as really a key aspect to people making better choices, which is, this is a key aspect of the kind of behaviour change that we want to see. Of course, you've then, on the other hand, got to be putting in the alternatives that you want to see people adopting, and you've got to make those attractive. And there can't be too many barriers to people taking those up. Otherwise, they won't. Otherwise, why would they? And so it has to be a big focus really on incentivising people to behave differently. And in transport, that means probably taking different forms of transport, more sustainable forms of transport, or thinking things through a little differently. I mean, there's one other thing I just wanted to highlight about this, and from an employer's perspective, you can really do a lot for your staff, I think, through this. In terms of health and well-being, by encouraging a different kind of commute. And incentivizing people maybe to do, with an e-bike, you can cycle 5 to 10 miles. You don't need to get sweaty. You don't even need showers then at work, except, employers that provide that, that'd be fantastic, But thinking through that promotes better health, it promotes better well-being. Of course, from an employer's, which I think is good for individuals, yeah? From an employer's perspective, I guess you're thinking, well, I'll probably get more work out of people as well, but you certainly get less sick days. I think the overall cost of business, this is good for business. I believe, I really firmly believe this could be good for business, and that's a key part of this as well. It should be part of an employer's package of kind of health and well-being.
Thanks, Bob. And you've just mentioned something just additional to touch upon in terms of looking at different modes of transport. What's obviously interesting with transport is that you've got central government policy and then you've got local authorities that run services. Just how do you see those two coming together? Because we've obviously got implementation of clean air zones, for instance. You've got others sort of setting net zero targets. How will the Transport Decarbonisation Plan sort of fit in with those other policies taking place between the departments?
Gosh, Tania, I feel like you've read. Have you seen the plan? There's a big focus on that. I mean, there has to be kind of local leadership but more than kind of right over to you kind of thing that might have happened in the past. You know, you've got so many areas that have declared climate emergencies, you know, who want to transform their local transport systems to bring the community together better, to work better for the high street that they've got, or to adapt to their own kind of unique circumstances. Again, I can't say too much about what's in the plan because it isn't agreed and hasn't been published yet. But this is a big focus, okay? Helping and supporting different places around the country to do what they need to do, because there's no single solution to all of this. If there was, then it would have worked from a national perspective. We could have just rolled it out and said, right, here you go, this is what you do. That's, you know, it's not right. However, having said that, there's not a million different ways of doing this. There are some key things that will work in similar places. So we need to we will be supporting local authorities through a number of levers. You know, we invest and fund an awful lot of transport projects around the country. You know, and so you know, we can use that and local leadership really to drive that change at a local level. And I think that's because that's where when it feels local, when it feels right to the place that it's happening in, I think it works best for the community, and it will, you know, certainly serve the needs of the people that need to use it in the best way.
Yeah, Ali, you mentioned obviously the public sector, large, you know, purchaser of vehicles, undertakes a lot of journeys. What are some of your reflections on what they need to help sort of, you know, step change this transition? They can actually be quite powerful in communities as well. If you sort of see shared mobility being used, actually incentivize others within the general public to start using these new forms of transport.
I was muted, sorry. For us, it always goes back to the data and really getting proper data. If you look outside of the transport sector and the global companies that have done so well, like all the Silicon Valley companies, they have data teams with hundreds of people sat there, number crunching, building AI queries to assess the data. And then transport sector, the data is there. But the trouble is, like, the most frequent census data that so many transport decisions are made of was from 2011. We've got a census coming up in 3 weeks' time that's going to be in the middle of COVID, that's going to give us some quite weird results. And that's going to be the best thing we've got to base decisions on. I think that local authorities should be doing their own censuses of transport data. They should be asking people, particularly now, how did you travel, how do you travel, and how did you want to travel? And are you interested in sustainable travel? And what modes would you be looking at? And what help can we give you? Ask the audience what they want to do, and then base your decisions on that. Don't just keep on dusting off old transport infrastructure projects that you've been waiting to do for the last 20 years. Ask people now, because behaviours have changed. We've got such an opportunity now to build on this shifting behaviour. And I think you said that we haven't yet cracked behaviour change. Well, we have cracked it. Right now, look at, we've got 50% cut in car emissions right now. People are behaving differently. We cracked it. We just don't understand why. Well, we do understand why, but we don't understand how to keep it there. So we've got to work out, how can we keep lots more people working from home? How can we support flexible working? How can we have flexible working and an effective bus route? How can we make sure supply matches demand much better? But I would start off, I'd encourage any public sector or any company at all to get the data, focus on the data, and then base decisions on that. Spend a year of investment on data, and then spend your future years building on that really valuable insight.
And how do we convince, you know, people about, you know, giving this data, Ali, across, especially during this time where we're being bombarded with a lot of discussion now in the public forum about your personal data being used? How do you actually go about those conversations as a business? And Mark, perhaps you could come in as well on that after.
Yeah, data, I mean, GDPR is there for a reason, but you basically have to make sure the audience you're asking are clear what's going to happen to their data. So they have to be in complete control of what happens to their data. But if you ask someone, say, we would like to not only ask you about how you travel, but we want to then be able to give you solutions about what services are available to you. We want to be able to keep communicating with you about changing things coming up. If the user ticks yes, then you can talk to them. Don't be afraid of asking the question, because you look at, again, going back to these big Silicon Valley companies, they do that all the time. And that's why they are learning so fast. We need to learn as fast as they are. And that comes from consumer insights. So ask the audience, get the data, and then build your decisions based on that.
Yeah, I think it's just to Ali's point, Tanya. It's be clear of what you want that information for, and I think if you're clear up front on this subject, I'd struggle to kind of understand why people wouldn't want you to use that data. You know, as long as it's meaningful and relevant to the topic of net zero commuting, you know, I'd struggle to find anybody in our organisation, knowing that climate is so key and core to our purpose. I'd struggle to find, you know, staff in our organisation that wouldn't want to give that information, and it's a challenge we have at the moment to give Ali and his team, you know, some of the data they need some of the information they need to help us. You know, we're just toying with that at the moment, but actually, I think if we're upfront and very clear on why we're asking the questions, how relevant that information is, and what we're going to do with it, that I think most people, to Ali's point, would tick that box of yes, happy for you to share.
Can I just give another example? So there's some really good data out there from the mobile phone operators of where phones are traveling. It's anonymous data, it shows flows, but it only shows flows from like one postcode area to another postcode area. It doesn't show from door to door. And transport is all around convenience, affordability, and basically for the service to be right there. So you need door-to-door information. If you've just got postcode area to postcode area, you haven't got that insight. So it's pretty useless in terms of helping see where people want to travel and when they want to travel. So we've got to go far more granular, and you can only do that by asking individuals if they're happy for you to use their data in a certain way.
Thanks, Ali. Thanks, Mark. Next big sort of area of discussion, modal shift. What do we mean by that? And obviously what we don't want to create is just a replication of everybody using, you know, their EV single occupancy again. You know, I was really drawn by that stat, you know, 90% of people sort of travel alone in that clip that you showed, Ali. But how do we actually enable people to undertake those modal shifts? Prime example from conversations with businesses across the country, you know, for some the car is the only option. For others, it's only the train. You wouldn't use a car, for instance, in a city. So just, you know, a broad question to the panel, sort of starting off, Ali, with yourself. How do we actually convince people now to change those modes wherever possible? But if it's not feasible, then what is the option there for modal shift?
So the two key bases for modal shift are people have to know that there's an option that's available for them, and they need to know that it's going to benefit them. So what's in it for them? Most people are completely unaware of the travel options available to them. So you've got to make sure they're aware. If only 5% of people know there's a bus that goes past the door, at best you can get 5% of people using that bus. So you've got to make sure people are aware. The other really important thing in this is it's not just the end user you need to inform. You need to inform the decision makers, policy makers, marketers all around them. So when you look at a company, you've got to have services that engage with the people that are going to be paying the budgets, or the people who are managing the car parks. They've got to be on board. So you need ways to engage with them to change their behaviours, change their mindset, and show them what's possible. Going back to the examples I quoted earlier, Arup went from, I think, 8% of their staff sharing cars to 55 within 6 months. 8% to 55% sharing cars within 6 months. Sandy from Arup was up on stage at the event probably a year and a half ago, saying that they no longer have any parking problems at all. It's completely fixed. They did that by reserving car parking spaces for car shows, a really effective marketing campaign, and a successful Liftshare scheme. Really simple. Users want the convenience, they want the affordability, and for things like car sharing, it's as convenient as going on your own. You basically chauffeur driven. It's half the price of driving on your own, and it's half the emissions. It's a win-win.
Bob, thoughts on modal shift?
Yeah, gosh. Thanks. Thanks for allowing me to put a couple of things on the record, I guess, as well, because too often people think that, you know, more space for cycling and walking is somehow an anti-car kind of message, or that decarbonisation is an anti-car kind of thing. That's not what it's about at all. It's about using the most appropriate and most suitable and the right form of transport for the right journey. You know, so many journeys are so tiny that they don't need to be one person, you know, in one car. But there are absolutely a whole number of journeys, you know, that where the car is absolutely the bang on choice. And there's a technology solution in terms of decarbonisation, you know, coming for that, or here, in fact, you know, with electric vehicles. Yeah, I probably.
Oh, I think we've
lost Bob.
might
He's
have
got
just
my gremlin.
lost Bob for a moment, but Mark, your reflections in the meantime whilst Bob comes back on in terms of those modal shifts between customers and also for your staff.
Yeah, I think it's about providing those options to them, making them aware. To Ali's point, I only yesterday afternoon I was having a conversation with a bike sharing business that are operational in a number of cities, and actually, people wouldn't consider cycling to work, but now there's a bike sharing scheme in that town or city. They're starting to use it, and they're starting to see the volume of trips going up. And actually, they've got anecdotal evidence that that's then causing people to say, well, actually, I quite like travelling to work by bike, and they've gone and bought bikes. Now, that to the bike sharing scheme, that's not good news because they're now no longer using their bikes; they've got their own. But talking to the CEO there, that's a big tick for them. That's a win. We've converted somebody to active travel. As I'd mentioned in my presentation, we've looked at mobility as a service. Ali and I have spoken about mobility as a service and how viable an option is it, and when do we get to mobility as a service? And it feels like a struggle right now. But if we can make it easy for commuters to use differing modes of transport, then that's going to help them make better choices. I think, but I just don't know when. I struggle to see when mobility as a service is going to be in play in its fullest form, and how far off that is.
And just building upon that, obviously, when you've got choice, obviously cost comes into this as well in terms of incentivizing different options. Who pays for the availability of these options? How have you thought about that cost dimension as a business, and how important is it to your customers as well?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I guess how have we thought about that? It's working all the time and understanding what the costs are and where we can assist with that. From a staff perspective, we're keen at putting all sorts of schemes in to try and help our staff. Cost of EV transition. We're trying to make salary sacrifice because of the benefits in kind that support that. We're trying to make that available to more staff. Bike to work, I touched on it. We're increasing that to bike to work scheme is a great scheme to dip in and make that ownership. But some people just can't afford an e-bike. They don't want to cycle because there's not showers or what have you there. So it's making that kind of the cost of investing in that different mode of transport easier. And we're looking at kind of, as I touched on, SME bike to work scheme. How can we help SMEs get through that challenge? And it's a cumbersome sort of admin challenge, but also a cost challenge of going into a bike to work scheme. They've got to lay out for the outlay of those bikes for their staff, and so we're exploring, could we support them with that cost, and how do we help them there?
Thanks, Mark. And Ali, your reflections when you're talking to businesses once they've got their score and they're looking at options. From your experience, how much does cost sort of factor into that? And is there anything that you think that government could do to help with that cost burden?
So in reality, it's not a cost, it's an added value. So when you do the sums of shifting people from driving alone to these other options, you end up saving parking spaces, which can save you an absolute fortune. You end up with a happier, healthier, retained workforce. So you reduce absenteeism. You also retain your staff much better. And if you think the average person leaving costs the company about £10,000 to £12,000 a year, you don't need to like have saved many staff from leaving to make all these investments very worthwhile. But it's the initial cost, and I think that's where the government have got a role to play. We've been doing this pilot up in Scotland with Como, where some funding enabled us to do scoping reports for about 20 local businesses, NatWest being one of them. And by giving them kind of almost the free way into this, to seeing the data, these companies now going on to investing in all these other initiatives, which is fantastic. So I think there is a role for government to play in kind of priming it to get people on board. But then it's very common business sense. It makes absolute sense to do this stuff because it's going to save you money and have a much happier, healthier workforce.
And Ali, do you have any sort of best practices examples that attendees can refer to of how they've gone through this process and what the outcome has been on the other side?
Yes, we've got lots. I mean, every situation is typically a bit different. But the simple process is to start off with working out what help you need. What is your key goal? Is it an environmental goal? Have you got a net zero target? Is it a parking requirement? Is it the fact you're moving office? Work out what the key thing is you want to achieve, and then get the data. Do a travel survey, get your ASOS score, do scoping, work out how your staff can travel to work. And then based on that, bring in partners from the public transport operators, bring in the e-scooter people, the e-bike people, to come and see the data and say, how can they help you get on that journey to net zero? And having got those people in, form your strategy. Spend your first year getting the data, then form your strategy and focus on maybe an initiative year, maybe year one, focus on active travel. Who can we get walking or cycling coming in? Or right now it might be working from home. How can we make sure all of our staff have got really decent broadband? Then move into lift sharing for the first 3-4 years, and then 5 years time, that's when EVs are really going to start kicking in. So before that, you want to get your infrastructure in place. 5 to 10 years, EVs will come in and start basically getting you down from between now and then. You can probably halve your emissions, and that can help you then get down to absolute zero. Things like e-buses coming in will be fantastic. If that can be speeded up, great, because at the moment buses aren't actually any more efficient than typically traveling with a colleague in a car. We need e-buses as soon as possible.
And just picking up on that point, Ali, because we've spoken about it quite a bit. I mean, what's the employer's role there in incentivizing that public transport use, especially because it's something much bigger and out of the control of employers?
So employers, I think once employers have got this data, it is in their interest to share it. We were with a hospital just a couple of weeks ago where it was really clear from the data that the buses weren't serving their site well enough. And simply by then bringing in the operator, which was first, to come and see the hospital, they were able to say, actually, we can tweak our services and provide a much better service. It also gives the employer the chance to say, actually, your services are slightly more expensive than they could be. Could we have a discount? Could we have a discount for our staff? And start talking to the operators about making sure that the bus comes in cheaper than the car. Because if the bus is cheaper than the car and it's door to door as possible, then many more people will turn to it. And employers have also got the issue of if they're leasing parking spaces, the more parking spaces they can release, they're going to save some money. So it's in their interest to reduce the number of parking spaces they've got, and maybe to invest that money in supporting their buses.
Brilliant, thank you. I'm conscious that we are coming up to the end of time. So in the last sort of 60 seconds, unfortunately, it looks like Bob has left us. So this might be a prime time to just ask you both, one big ticket item that you want to see from the Transport Decarbonisation Plan coming out in the summer. Ali first.
I mean, I think I've said it. I was so happy to see the plan come out, and it was so good to read it. But then it just struck me like, where are commuters? Where are employers in this? The employers have to be brought on board because they have such an important role to play. So for me, they need to find ways to engage with employers, and ideally, they need to make commuting emissions reported on, and business travel. Business travel is the other big one. If companies have to report on it, they will overnight form teams to work out how to reduce it, and that will have an immediate impact.
Mark, from the perspective of an employer and business.
I'll give a personal perspective, if you don't mind, Tania. For me, it's that active travel infrastructure. I see lots of people that would love to commute by bike, e-bike, but they just won't. The infrastructure's not there. They don't feel safe. We've had this drive for let's just make more and more space for cars. Hopefully the plan will address that, and I think if it does that, then it needs to be kind of addressed the same across the whole country. Unfortunately, you've got different local authorities doing different things, and you can go from one part of the country to another, and you get a completely different experience when it comes to active travel. So I'd like to see that levelling up, and that's a personal perspective.
Well, that's a really important perspective to have, because at the end of the day, we are individuals first. We do travel, and that's what makes this, topic so interesting.
Yeah.
Thank you all for joining us, attendees today. Thank you for bearing with the technical difficulties. This is just the way of the 2021 COVID life, but I'd like to thank Ali Clabburn once again, Mark Dodwell, Bob Moran for joining us this morning to talk through achieving net zero commutes. The recording of today's session will be available online on YouTube, and it will be sent directly to attendees. All that's left from myself to say is thank you so much for joining. Clearly, we've got a big challenge ahead of us, but as Ali notes, this is a time for opportunity. We have made big changes. The key now is making sure that some of these are embedded for life beyond the pandemic, and as we build back better, as the UK actually hosts COP26 as well at the end of the year. It's been lovely to see you all. Goodbye for now.